Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's Congressman Jason Crow joining you for our next installment of our virtual job training series. As many of you know, last year we held the first ever Congressional District 6 job fair, where we brought together over 1,000 job seekers at over 60 employers and helped many people find new jobs or take their career or profession to the next level. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we're not able to do that this year. We're not able to get everybody into the same room or gymnasium and connect people in person. So we're figuring out how do we connect people and give folks the help that they need during this very difficult time. Now, our country and our community is going through one of our biggest challenges right now. We have a pandemic that we haven't seen in over 110 years, or 102 years. It's been since the 1918 Spanish flu that we've dealt with a public health crisis of this magnitude. We haven't dealt with economic downturn since the Great Depression of this nature and of this size. So we're dealing with both of those things now at the same time, which our country has never dealt with. So we're in uncharted territory, and we're figuring out how do we come around each other, how do we support each other during this time and help each other out to move forward, make sure that we're recovering our economy, we're getting people back to work, and we're also addressing this health crisis. So we put together this virtual training series to help people get the skills they need to seek new jobs or to re-enter the workforce if they've been laid off. We've done resume skill building, and tonight we're going to be focusing on telephone or virtual interviewing, which is what a lot of the interviews actually are coming down to these days, is over the phone or over Zoom. So we're really excited to have Beth Hobbs with Arapahoe Douglas Works, who's really an expert in this area, who's going to walk you through best practices and things to think about as you are talking to potential employers over the phone or over Zoom or whatever platform it is you're using. So we're excited to have Beth join us. Hope you're getting a lot out of these seminars and these training sessions. But please know that my staff is standing by to help you and your family if you have any issues with your federal benefits or resources. So if you need help navigating Social Security benefits or Medicare or Medicaid or VA or anything involving a federal agency, we have people standing by in my office who will take your call and help you and your family work through those issues. It's one of the most important things that we do. And last thing I'll mention is I'm working really hard in Washington to try to make sure we're addressing the economic crisis. We know that unemployment benefit extension lapses in just a few weeks here, actually less than a week towards the end of the month. We're working hard to make sure that we're providing that aid to folks in either direct cash payments on unemployment extension and other economic aid to make sure that you're able to support you and your family, that you can pay your rent and pay your mortgage, buy food and pay your bills during this very difficult time. So we're working hard to make sure that we can make that happen. So with that, we'll turn it over to Beth Hobbs with Arapahoe Douglas Works for joining us. And thank you so much, Beth, for giving your time and your talent this evening to help folks out. Over to you.
Thank you, Representative Crow. I'm happy to be here tonight to share with you some information. Let me just begin by saying that I'm a career advisor at Arapahoe Douglas Works, and one of several. My main function is to facilitate workshops such as these, but also to work with our older adult population in helping them find new opportunities. So with that, I am going to give you one message, and that is that if you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, and then I will address all of those at the conclusion of the presentation. And with that, I am going to share my screen, so bear with me for just a moment, please. All right, here we go. So tonight we're going to talk about phone screening and phone interviews. They're similar in some ways and different in others. And so I want to make sure that I clarify the difference between those and then share a little bit of information about them. So we're going to talk a little bit about how do we prepare for those phone interviews. How do we communicate successfully? Because that's really the key, is how do we communicate in all of this. I'll talk a little bit about how do we handle tough questions. Tough questions are always the ones we don't want to answer. And so we'll chat a little bit about that. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about how do you as a potential employee ask strong questions during the interview process to differentiate yourself from others who may be interviewing as well. So first of all, let me just share with you the difference between phone interviews and phone screens, because some of this information will work for some of them and not so much for others. So a phone screen is when an HR professional calls you up and wants to spend about 20 minutes with you. It's usually the first phone call you get. And what they're doing is they've looked at a number of resumes. They've selected maybe 20 of them, and they want to narrow that down to 10. So the way they do that is through a phone screen. So it's a quick conversation, generally with an HR professional, in which they're just asking you some questions about your resume to verify that what they have read there is matches what you intended it to say, and that it matches up with the job that they have. So, and then assuming that that's a match, they take your resume and they then turn it over to a hiring manager to go through a more formal interview process. What we're seeing is that some of those interviews, those more formal interviews, are also now phone interviews. Phone interviews or video interviews. And so much of what I'm going to talk about really has more to do with the actual interview part of it than it does a phone screen, but I'll kind of differentiate as I go through those. So one of the things that's really important as you prepare for any kind of interview situation, whether it's actually a phone interview or an in-person interview, is you want to make sure that you have all the information you need about the job. And in the case of a phone interview, you can have it right at your fingertips on your desk or your table where you're sitting. So that's what kind of differentiates actually a phone interview, which is one of the advantages of doing a phone interview. And when I say information, I'm really talking about having things like your resume and your cover letter and the job description and research that you've done on that position, and having it all right next to you, having it at eye level so that you can refer to it if you need to. You need to have read it through carefully enough so that you only have to glance at it to be able to speak to them. You also want to have done some research on the job itself and on the organization, because that information is going to be important as you get into that interview situation. We also encourage people to dress as though you were going to meet people in person. The reason for that is when we tend to get dressed up in our interview clothes, we feel differently about ourselves, we sit differently, our voice projects differently, and so we want to be in that place as we get ready for this phone interview. One of the most important things, and I think as we're getting more familiar with Zoom and other platforms like this, is finding that quiet place where you can go and hold this interview. We used to tell people that a really great place to go is a library, and to my knowledge, the libraries aren't open for that right now. The workforce centers do have some room. Arapahoe Douglas has a few rooms that if you let us know a day in advance, we can certainly set up a room for you there with a computer and a camera if you need the camera, or just even with the phone if that's all you need for the phone interview. But find a place that can be a quiet place. If you're doing it from your home, that's great. Just make sure that you have corralled the animals into a place where they're not going to be heard on the phone call. The same thing as you want to have someone keeping their eye on the children so we don't have children crying in the background, obviously toilet flushing. For me, I know when I do these kinds of things, it has more to do with shutting the window so that I don't get the outside noises of someone mowing the grass. So just think about that space that you're going to be in ahead of time, and what kinds of noises are around you and what do you need to kind of mitigate and think about ahead of time. When we think about getting prepared, sometimes people tend to look for that really comfy place in their home to interview from, and it may be the couch or a place like that. We strongly recommend that you don't interview from your couch because, again, the way in which you sit on the couch is very different than when you sit at a table. And so you want to sit in a place where you're comfortable, but also where your voice is going to project. So we also don't recommend that you interview from your car. And I know I get that question quite a bit. Well, I have, I can take phone calls in my car. What about if I do it there? And the reason we say no to that is it's very difficult to keep your attention on two things. One, the road, obviously, if you're driving, and the second, on the questions that are being asked of you. The other thing is you lose the ability to have information around you that might be helpful to you during this phone interview. And so if it's absolutely essential that you be in your car, I would say find a parking lot, park in the most remote part of the parking lot, and shut the car down and interview that way if you have to be in the car. But I really recommend that a far better place is to be in your home at a desk or in some kind of place where you know it's going to be quiet. There's also a lot of noise that sometimes when you're driving is around you and can be heard even through the phone in your car. So get prepared. Think about that place you want to be and that information you want to have with you. Once the call starts, you want to be ready to talk about every job transition. And so when you think about the jobs that you've had that are on your resume, think about what is the reason that I've left that position and have an answer to that. Be ready to talk about all of the bullet points on your job, on your resume as well. HR screeners, so those that are doing phone screens, generally their job is to walk through your resume and, as I said, verify the information that's there, make sure that what they're reading and what they're understanding is exactly what you meant. So make sure that you have the same resume you have sent them. One of the things that we tell job seekers is that the best way to find jobs is to target your resume. And by targeting your resume, I mean that every time you find a job description that you're interested in and you want to send a resume, you want to target that resume or edit the resume that you have to this new job description. So if they have 5 qualifications for the job, you want to make sure that on your resume, you talk about your experiences as they relate to those 5 qualifications. So because of that, the resume that you send to one company may be different than the resume you send to another. The types of skills and experience that you have that you highlight may be different. So make sure when you get on a phone interview that you have the correct copy of the resume that you sent to this organization. It is possible that they may say to you, tell me a little bit more about bullet number 3. Okay, so you're going to need to be looking at the same piece of paper that they're looking at, or the same resume that they're looking at. Generally, in terms of a screening call, HR people are looking at a checklist for them. They're really going through and just making sure that they understand completely the reasons why you left different employers, the work that you did. They make sure that the qualifications, the basic qualifications for the position are ones that you meet. So think of it this way. If they have 20 people that they pulled out that they think could be good candidates for a position, it's unlikely they will interview 20 people, but they might phone screen 20 people. And from that, they're going to narrow it down to say 8 people, 10 people, or 6, whatever number they're looking at. But so this is really that going through the checklist, making sure they're going to find the person that whose qualifications they think most closely fit what they're looking for. So be confident in the answers that you give them. One of the things that people are most drawn to is confidence. And so the way we become confident doing phone interviews, or for that matter, any kind of interview, is practice. And so think about the reasons that you left your last position. Maybe you were recruited away to another position. Maybe you left because you were looking for greater responsibilities. Maybe you left because you were part of a layoff situation, part of a larger company restructure. Or in this case, I think we're going to hear a lot from individuals who say, I was part of a layoff because of COVID. Okay, but have those answers ready to go so that you can sound confident when you give those answers for why you left your last position. And make sure that you're able to provide the necessary details from every bullet point on your resume. You know, sometimes we write our resume and then we start applying for jobs. And if we aren't doing any editing of our resume, sometimes a few months can pass and we aren't sure exactly what we put on that resume. So make sure that you're able to explain those bullet points. If you're giving examples of things that you've done within an organization, projects that you've led, work that you've done, make sure you're able to explain that. But also, we encourage you to be brief. Less than 60 seconds is a great amount of time to be able to explain the bullet points. You want to give people enough information so that they understand what the type of work you were doing and the responsibilities that you had and how those qualifications meet the qualifications that you're looking for. But we aren't looking to get into the weeds of the exact work that you did. So if you give too much detail, you can oftentimes lose people. And that's probably one of the things that one of the biggest mistakes that people make is I want to so tell you about my involvement in a particular program or project that I get too deep into the details and I actually lose people in the telling of the story, and especially on the telephone. But it's even true in person. Really what employers are looking to figure out is they want to know, what is it you know? And can you do the job that they have in front of them? So they want you to be able to explain what you've done, but they also don't need to know all of the details of what you've done. So sometimes there are things that aren't said in interviewers, and people, especially HR professionals, are really trained to understand tone and hidden meanings. And this is where practice and confidence really comes into play. One of the biggest ways to communicate is through nonverbal communication. And when we get into a telephone situation, we oftentimes lose the nonverbal communication. So they perhaps aren't seeing me. They aren't seeing me smile. They aren't seeing other things about me and making judgments based on that. So what they are making judgments on is the tone that I use. Do I sound confident? Do I sound like I know what I'm talking about? Do I have a strong voice, or is my voice trailing off at the end of my answers? Or is it lilting up as though I have a question? So they're also checking for things sometimes that don't get said. And this is when we aren't sure how to answer things and we kind of stumble around. Sometimes it can look like we're trying to hide something. And so again, practice interviewing with other individuals, with friends, with family, just so that when you give answers to questions, you're very clear about the answer and your voice is strong. You want to make sure that you convey that confidence that you have and convey that you know what your abilities are. I know what my skills are. I know the value that I can bring to your organization. But I also want to, during that call, I want to show some of my personality, because we do know that in interviewing that the first hurdle is, can you do the job? But the second hurdle is really all about, am I a good fit for this organization, for their culture? And the way that that comes through is it really comes through your personality. So you want to to answer the questions completely. You want to have listened to what the question was so that you make sure that's the answer you give matches the question, because sometimes we tend to go down a different path, on a bit of a rabbit hole. We don't want to do that, but we also want to show some of our personality as we interview with people, and especially on phone interviews, because they don't have the visual of seeing you. So sometimes there are things we call red flags in the interview situations. And these are the things that generally we're most afraid to talk about. And for everybody, there's something different. You know, sometimes for some individuals, it's issues of age. Am I too old for this? Are they going to think that I'm too old? Are they going to think that I'm overqualified? Are they going to think that I have too many employment gaps on my resume, or I've been job hopping, or other things? So be ready to address issues like that. And people often say to me, well, they can't ask me my age. And that's true. They cannot ask you your age. However, they may look at your experience and say, you appear to be overqualified for this position. And if you're in that position, you've had maybe a fairly long work history, make sure you have an answer for that question. Yes, I may have more skills than what you're looking for, but I bring more value to the organization than perhaps other applicants that you're looking at. So make sure you know why you're applying to that position. And sometimes that's a tough one for people, because especially in this time, many people feel like they need to get back to work. And so if I can't get back to work doing what I was doing, I need to get back to work doing something else. But employers want to know that you indeed want to work a particular job you're applying for. And so you have to be able to address things like being overqualified. For others, it's employment gaps. And so when we say employment gaps, I'm talking about when you've been out of work for a year or more. And we see this most often probably with individuals who have stayed home to raise children. We see it with individuals who have taken time off, maybe to spend time with an older parent. We see it with people who've had some significant health issues to address and have had to leave the workforce for a time. And so again, think about, how am I going to address that? I want it to be short. I want it to be concise. I don't want to get into too much detail about that, but I also need to be able to address that if I'm asked about that. Job hopping, a little less important. We used to think that you couldn't possibly leave a job unless you've been there at least 2 years. 5 would be even better. That's changed a lot in the last decade and a half. We see more people moving around from job to job. But even here, if you are taking too many jobs within, then you have to be willing to address that. Now, in some cases, we have people who've worked for temp agencies and who have taken any number of temp assignments during that amount of time. That's a great explanation. For others, they have tried maybe going out on their own and then deciding that wasn't for them. But come up with that answer to, why do I have so many jobs in this short amount of time? Make sure that as you're talking to them, you want to control the perspective, which is why you don't want to be caught off guard by someone asking you, are you overqualified? What about the gaps in your employment? Why do you have so many jobs in the last couple of years? You want to be able to speak confidently to that. And the way to do that is to put together an answer ahead of time. So when you're asked that question, you know how to answer it. Make sure you stay factual. Okay, we don't want to create some kind of story around that, but we certainly do want to give them enough information that they understand what was going on in our life during those times, or why we made the decision to apply to this particular position at this point in time. So the key to interviewing, really, and I've seen this a lot with the people that I work with at 80 Works, is practice. When we were open as a workforce center, fully open, we used to do mock interviews. And I had people who came back week after week and did mock interviews just so that they could practice and they could get more used to what they were going to say and they could get more comfortable in that interview setting. The same thing can be done again with friends or family, is practicing. One of the things we have at 80 Works on our website is a list of about 72 of the most commonly asked questions. And so it's a great sheet to work your way through, and not all of the questions might you be asked, but it's a good sheet to work your way through and think, do I have an answer to this question? What might that be? It's a great way to practice with someone else and to think about not only what you want to say, but how you want to say it. So I would encourage you even to go online and to Google interview questions, and you'll find lists and lists of questions and that you can use to practice with someone else. Because what we think in our head, sometimes when it comes out of our mouth, it sounds different. And so you want to spend a little bit of time practicing saying those answers out loud before you get into actually doing interviews. Some of the most common questions you're going to hear, certainly the first one is, tell me about yourself. And tell me about yourself is closely related, people put on their resumes. It's also closely related to elevator speeches. So if you think about elevator speeches for a moment, that's really when someone says to you, what do you do for a living? It's giving a professional definition, really, of what do I do? So do I say something like, I'm a skilled learning and development professional, having worked in several industries, most recently in healthcare, and my strengths are communication, training, whatever else I want to go into, okay? So it's that kind of quick explanation of who am I professionally, okay? And again, like I say, it's the same information that we write out on a professional summary on our resume. And it's the information that we share with people that we meet everywhere when we answer that question, so what do you do for a living? And it's the same information we give when we're asked in an interview, the question, tell me about yourself. So it's really about, how do I define myself professionally? One of the other questions that pops up pretty regularly, honestly, is what is your biggest strength? Sometimes, what is your biggest weakness? So let me give you just a couple of tips around strengths and weaknesses. First of all, you have lots of strengths, lots of them over the time that you've been working. But what you want to think about when you interview are, what are the strengths that I have, the one or two that relate most closely to the position I'm applying for. So I might have all kinds of strengths, but they don't all necessarily connect to the position that I'm applying for. So I want to look for those strengths that do. And certainly the best way to do that is to review that job description several times and say, what are the strengths they're looking for here? And are those strengths the ones I have? And those are the ones I want to address when they ask me that question. So I can not only share with them what I perceive my strengths to be, my big strengths, or maybe two of them, but I can also tell a short story about them and why I believe that's a strength of mine. So in that way, I can not only give my opinion of my greatest strengths, but I can also relay it to my past experiences, which are the best predictor of how I'm going to do in the future, relay that story to demonstrate to them that I indeed do have this strength. So that one is a relatively easy question to answer generally. What is more concerning to people is when they ask you, what is your biggest weakness, or what is your weakness? We encourage people to think about weaknesses that are hard skills versus soft skills. So when we talk about hard skills, I'm talking about something that I can test you on. So a hard skill is like the ability to drive a forklift. It's the ability to operate Microsoft Office or to make PowerPoint presentations, because I can actually give you a test to determine your level of skill in those areas, okay? And where soft skills are those that are much harder to test you on. They're things like problem solving, critical thinking, customer service, conflict resolution. Those kinds of things are soft skills. And so it's much more difficult for me to determine your level of proficiency in that, you know? So I always look for a weakness that I have that can be fixed. I'll give you an example. So in my case, I oftentimes look for a weakness like I am a basic Microsoft Excel user. And so since I don't apply for jobs where I need to know Microsoft Excel, this is a great weakness because I can work on getting better at that. And in fact, I will tell you over several years, I probably have gotten better at it. I haven't gotten truly proficient at it. So it's a great answer to this question. But it's the kind of thing that, should it be needed in the workplace, I certainly could get better at it. I could take training in it. I could demonstrate proficiency probably without too much difficulty. If I were to tell you that my biggest weakness was dealing with conflict, then all of a sudden that brings up all kinds of questions in the interviewer's mind. So does that mean this person doesn't get along with people? How am I going to determine how much of a weakness is that, and how is that going to impact the organization or the department that they're working in or their coworkers, that kind of thing. So think about the answer to those questions ahead of time about your strengths. And again, your strengths, while you have many of them, pick the ones that most directly relate to the job. And weaknesses, you really want to pick something that doesn't impact this particular position. So if I were ever applying for a job where Microsoft Excel was one of the qualifications, I certainly wouldn't use it as a weakness. Another question sometimes is around salary expectations. Now, sometimes that question gets asked on an online application. Sometimes it's actually asked in an interview. And as much as possible, we want to say, I would prefer to talk about salary expectations when I have an offer on the table. So that sometimes will work, sometimes it doesn't, and they'll press you for an amount. And the problem with giving salary expectations is that salary is heavily dependent on the benefit package that goes with it. And so if someone's offering you, let's just take a round number of $50,000, $50,000 a year looks different if they're paying all of your healthcare benefits than if it's $50,000 a year and you're paying all of your healthcare benefits. So it really is dependent upon the entire compensation package, which is why many times organizations don't even get into that conversation until there is an offer on the table, until they're willing or ready to offer you a position, and they're going to not only tell you about the salary, they're going to tell you about the benefits as well that may go along with that position. But having said all of that, I would say it's always good to walk into any kind of an interview knowing the range of what this position would pay. So there are different websites you can go online to find out what would this position typically pay. You can go to salary.com, you can go to ONET online, Glassdoor sometimes has that information. So there are places where you can investigate for this type of position, what is generally the salary range. And if I've pushed to give a salary in an interview situation, I want to give a range. Now, I want to make sure that the bottom of the range that I give is a salary that I'm comfortable with. Okay, so, but certainly giving them a range if you're pushed for a number is a good way to go. Also, it's good to have in your mind some thoughts around what are my goals? Where am I hoping to be in 3 years and 5 years? That kind of thing. For some people who come into a position, my goal in 3 years is to be promoted to the next level up, maybe a couple levels up. I hope someday to be the supervisor, the manager, whatever it is. For other people, they may say, in 5 years or in 3 years, I hope to be the very best customer service agent you have in this department. I want to be adding more value 5 years from now than I will upon entering this position. So not everybody is looking necessarily to move up the ladder, so to speak, and that's okay, but just think about what are your goals looking forward. And so in all of this, one of the things you really want to be doing is practicing your responses to make sure that when you answer questions, you're somewhere around that 1 minute time frame. Sometimes when we go over that amount of time, too far over that, again, we kind of get into the weeds with things and we tend to lose our audience. So, whoops. So make sure that when you go into an interview situation that you have done your homework. One of the questions you're almost always going to be asked is, do you have any questions for us or any questions for me as the interviewer? The answer to that is always yes. You want to have prepared questions ahead of time. Okay, and I recommend that you have 3 questions prepared ahead of time for this interview. Now that's a little bit different generally if you're on a screening interview, the questions you would ask, and I'll kind of address those. If you are on a screening interview, you want to ask always, what is your process and your timeline for making a decision on this position? And I say process because I want to know, is this a case where I'm going to have 1 interview or 2 interviews? Or maybe there's 3 interviews and at the end of that I have to give a presentation for this position. So I want to know, what does that whole process look like? The other thing I want to know is I want to know about your timeline. I want to know, are you interviewing all of the applicants today and you're going to be making a decision by the end of the week? Because if I don't hear back from you by that time, I might want to follow up with you. Or are you going to tell me that you're interviewing people over the next week and then I'm not going to follow up until after that amount of time? And one of the things that this question also does for people is that it lessens their anxiety about the time it's taking to hear back from people who have invited us in for interviews. Sometimes we think that once we've interviewed, we should be hearing from somebody like tomorrow. That rarely happens. It does happen sometimes, but it rarely happens. And so the more information that I have, knowing your timeline and the process that I'm going to be expected to go through to get to the final goal, it just lessens my anxiety and makes it much easier for me to wait and for your phone call or your email. The other questions that you want to ask when you get into an actual phone interview with a hiring manager, though, are questions that, first of all, prove that you've done some research on the company. And I haven't talked a lot about research, but research is things like, have I looked at their website? Do I know what their mission statement is? Have I looked to see if they have maybe a vision statement or some values, or maybe there's some leadership principles that appear on their website? So I want to have looked at their website very carefully to kind of gather information about the kind of work that they're doing, the projects that they may be involved in, something perhaps about the culture of the organization. I also want to go to places like LinkedIn and Facebook, and I want to look to see if they're posting on those 2 places. Oftentimes the most up-to-date projects get put in places like that. Companies share that information. So I want to know about those kinds of things. So those are potential questions that I can ask a little bit more information on. It also may tell me things about the culture of the organization. So let's say we have an organization that does community outreach in some way, or community projects. I want to know about that ahead of time so that I can ask some questions about that proves that I know something about who you are as an organization and what's important to you. And I can share that information either through questions at the end, or sometimes I can share it even through interview questions that I'm asked. When I share my experiences, I can connect that to things that I've read either on your web pages or on your social media accounts. So really take the time to do some research on the organization to find out as much as you can about the kind of work that they're doing, the future projects that they have, and the culture of the organization. Because at the end of the day, they're going to hire people who fit into their culture. So the more I know about that, the more I can demonstrate that I'm a fit for that. I also want to ask questions that give me information that I can either use in the moment or I can use on future interviews. So if I say things, if I ask questions like, tell me what does your ideal candidate look like? And they come back with some answers. I can either respond in the moment and say to them, I'm glad to hear that because those skills are exactly what I have and here's where I've demonstrated those in the past. Or I can take that information and when I get to that next interview, I can use that information again to connect myself and my skills to what the organization is looking for. So I really encourage people to think about questions that are going to get them information that either they can tie themselves directly to the organization or they can use in the future. It's not a time to ask about start dates or salary or benefits. And I say that because oftentimes when organizations get into interviewing, they have a good idea when they'd like somebody to start. But life happens sometimes and those start dates can get pushed out. And so at some point down the road, and certainly when you're offered a position, they're going to give you a start date of when they'd like you to begin your position. And you may also want to negotiate that at that time. And the best time to negotiate that is when there's an offer on the table. You don't want to do that ahead of time. The same thing is true about salary. The rule is kind of you don't talk about salary until they talk about salary. And so ideally that comes at the time when they're offering you a position. Again, you are in the best position then to negotiate salary. And the same is true of benefits, really. It is unlikely that if you are with a hiring manager in many organizations that they're going to want to go into benefits in detail with you. That's generally the role of an HR professional. So there will be plenty of time for you to ask about salary, to ask about benefits, but it's not on a phone interview. One of the most important things that you want to do, though, on any interview is to really show your enthusiasm and convey the message that I really want to work for this organization and I want to work in this position. We hear oftentimes from recruiters when I ask them questions like, what's an ideal candidate look like to you? And they come back and they say to me, I want somebody who wants to work for us. And I'm always stunned by that because it kind of seems to me like a no-brainer kind of thing. And they've said, you know, people oftentimes don't necessarily convey the message that they really want to work for this organization. Obviously, everybody who comes through the door is looking for work, but you want to make sure that the interviewer knows that you really want to work for this organization and you want to work in this position. And so at the end of any interview, we always say, you know, one of the things that you want to do is to ask for the job. And that's not as simple as just saying, I want this job, but it has more to do with after the time that we've spent together, and I've learned more about your organization, and I was really excited when I came through the door, when I got on this phone call with you about this organization, but I can tell you that I'm now even more excited, and I can see myself really adding value to your organization, to your department, to the work that you do. So make sure that they clearly understand your enthusiasm for this position. Whoops. Okay, well, we just lost the screen. So the last one, let me try this again. For some reason, we have just lost the last screen that I wanted to share with you. So as I've talked about today, it's really important to prepare for that phone interview. And by preparing, we're talking about doing the research on the organization, doing the research, even about the people you may be talking to. Now that's unlikely on a phone screen, but when you get into an actual interview that takes place over the telephone, you want to ask when you're invited for that interview, who am I going to be speaking to, and can you give me their title? Because then I can go to places like LinkedIn and I can look them up and I can learn a little bit about them. So you want to do, again, research on the organization, research on who you're going to talk about. If you know people inside of an organization, you certainly want to talk with them about the organization and the culture that's there. And then be really prepared for that phone interview, to have your research by you, to have your job description, to have your resume, a cover letter if you've written one, and the questions that I'm going to ask at the end of the interview. Now, it may be that something comes up during the interview and I want to ask that question as well, and that's just fine, but have 3 prepared in advance. We want to make sure that we communicate successfully, and again, that comes through finding a spot that is quiet, where I am sitting up so that my voice projects, that I feel like I have the information that I need around me, that I am mindful of my tone, and that I'm exuding confidence when I speak. We talked a little bit about the tough questions. Tough questions are always those that we're most afraid to be asked. Think about those in advance and come up with answers to that. And if you're struggling with that, I would say contact a career advisor at one of the workforce centers. AD Works has a number of people that talk with people who are going into interview situations, and we talk about, so what are the tough questions? What are the things you're afraid they're going to ask you? And how do we work through an answer for that ahead of time? And lastly, be prepared with strong questions that you're going to ask the interviewers that shows that I know something about you. I know something about the organization, and I know something about the work, and I know that I'm a strong candidate for you, a good match. So with that, I am going to conclude, and I am going to take questions from that you may have put in the Q&A box here. So let me just, so someone asked, can you elaborate on hidden meanings that employers might infer? What code words should I avoid? It's not as much about code words as if somebody asks me a question and I can't answer that. So let me give you an example of that. If someone asks me, so why did you leave your last employer? And I have to sit and think about that. And I kind of hem and haw, and then I say, well, I left because I really thought I wanted to do something else. So I don't sound confident. And so then the HR screener, or maybe it's the hiring manager, begins to think, is there something more there? Is there something that you're not saying about why you left? So that's why I say to you ahead of time, think about the answers to things like, why did you leave your last employer? And maybe the employer before that. We do tell you when you write resumes to only go back 10 years, maybe 15 at the most. So for most people, it's not that many transitions or employers that they've left. So it's not about code words per se, it's about being confident that I don't give the impression that I'm trying to make up an answer, okay? said, sorry, didn't get to finish. Please comment more on the value that as an older worker can give as an edge over a younger person. So older workers bring generally an immense amount of experience. And you have to think about that, and you have to think about, how am I going to convey that in an interview? So we have organizations today that are going through just amazing change, organizational change. For many of us who've been in the workplace for a while, this isn't the first time we've seen this. Now, it may be the first time we've seen a pandemic and the first time we've seen it quite like this, but we have expertise about living in organizations that are experiencing change. And so we can speak to those kinds of things. Maybe we've done customer service work and we've dealt with all different kinds of customers. And so we can speak to our years of doing that kind of thing. So it's really about looking at what are the experiences that I have that really are of value to this organization. So when I get asked the question, are you overqualified? Oftentimes we'll speak to the fact that this, first of all, this is a position that I am choosing to apply for. And here's why I'm choosing to apply for that. And second of all, yes, I may have more qualifications than you're looking for, but that's a value add that I bring that many of your other applicants don't bring. I bring more experience. I bring more skills. And so you want to think about, how are you going to phrase that in an interview? Someone asked me if I've ever heard of a STAR interview. So STAR interviews are, I think she's referring to behavior-based interviews. And so in behavior-based interviews, people are asking you questions like, tell me about a time when you did this or that. Tell me about a time when you had to deal with a difficult customer. Tell me about a time when you had to do a project under a short timeline. And so the STAR format for answering that question, which I think is brilliant, frankly, says, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to start with the situation. I'm going to tell you where I am, who I am in this story. I'm going to tell you what the task was in front of me. I'm going to tell you what the action I took was. And lastly, I'm going to end up with what was the result of that situation. And so you can put together STAR stories ahead of time, and we recommend that people put together about 5 or 6. Think about things that happened in your career that that were memorable to you. Maybe they were challenging projects that you took on. Maybe they were things that you were rewarded for, or you know, just things that that you thought, I did a really good job here. And maybe nobody knew about that, but you knew about it. And it was an example of something you did that was, you thought was kind of amazing. And so you put those stories together ahead of time, you write them out in that format. And then when you go into the interview, you give each of your stories a little one-word name, and you can put that in your notebook, and you can glance at that when someone says to you, so tell me about a time when you had to deal with a difficult customer. And you don't have to think that up right then and there. You've already put that story together ahead of time. And generally, a STAR story can sometimes be the answer to, tell me about a time when you had to deal with a difficult customer. But maybe the same story would be, you could tell if somebody asked you, tell me about how you handle conflict. Tell me about how you problem solve. Tell me about your conflict resolution skills. That same story could apply. So it's not like you need to have a lot of them, but it's good to have those experiences kind of written down in this format. And the good thing about the format is it gives you a clear beginning and a clear end. One of the worst things people do with stories is they start in the middle, and then they start to ramble, and then they think of something they should have told you before. So this way you lay it out, you know exactly what you're going to say and how to relay that story so people understand the point you're trying to make. On the questions to the interview, should you ask about how the person likes the company? We often see this question, and I find it interesting because I have interviewed a lot of people in my career, and you know, when somebody asks me that, or asks anybody that, obviously if I'm in an interview situation, I'm going to tell you what I like about this, you know, but I'm also not likely to tell you any negatives either. So think about, I'm not sure you get a whole lot of information from that. How much should you speak during an interview compared to the interviewer? Obviously, you're the one who should be doing the majority of the speaking during an interview, but remember to keep your answers short, to keep them succinct, clear. If they think you haven't given enough information or they want more information, let them ask for it. But think about that 60-second time frame. Now it runs a little bit longer if we start to tell stories. I would say you maybe can go up to 2 minutes, but you shouldn't go beyond that. How do you end a phone interview? So if it is a screening interview, the HR professional would be very clear about when the end of the interview is. Otherwise, in a regular phone interview, I end it with, let me tell you how much I've enjoyed speaking with you today. Thank you for your time. And I want you to know that everything I've heard here today has just made me more convinced that I am a good candidate for you. I have the skills you need, and I would love to be a part of your team, or something like that. But again, it's that whole point of asking for the job is how you end that interview. It says, if an employer asks me to do a timed video recorded test in a Zoom interview, is that normal? I'm uncomfortable with it, and I have an interview with an employer that wants me to do a math test on screen to prove that it's me answering the question and not a family member. Wow. I've not heard that one before. We do know that there are organizations that do timed video recorded tests where they give you a question, you have so long to answer it, it moves on to the next one. I've not heard of one that wanted to do a math test on the screen. I'm assuming that there's some math involved in this position. And so they are looking to verify that that's you, I suppose, not a family member. But, you know, I would go with it and try it and see how that goes. That is interesting. If an employer asks me if I want to do a phone interview or an in-person interview, besides coronavirus safety, is there any benefit to choosing phone interview instead of an in-person interview? I think it depends a lot on you, real honestly. For me, I would always rather be in front of someone because I get to read facial expressions. I get to really just, there's so many nonverbal cues that come up in an in-person interview. On the other hand, the value of a phone interview, as I said before, it's kind of like an open book test. I can have all of this information spread out with me in front of me. And so sometimes that really helps as I'm answering questions. Now, there are ways to take some of that information into an in-person interview. I always encourage people that if you go into an in-person interview, take the most important qualifications of that position, write it down on the front page of your notebook, have your star stories that you've given a 1 or 2 word name to listed, have your questions that you're going to ask at the end in that notebook. So, I mean, there are ways to take some of that information with you, but certainly in a phone interview, I can have all kinds of information about the organization itself that I probably wouldn't take into an in-person. So it just kind of depends. I really do think, though, given the situation we're in right now, we are going to see many, many more phone interviews, and we're going to see many more video interviews. But at the end of the day, if the position is one that you're going to have to be on site at that organization, in all likelihood, you will be called in for an in-person interview at some point in time. So, no other questions? Okay, well then, thank you for spending this afternoon with me. I appreciate it. And if you have any further questions, I can be reached at Arapahoe Douglas Works, and we would be happy to answer any and all questions for you there. We also do a number of workshops like this one on resume writing, on interviewing, on networking, on negotiating salary. and on emotional intelligence as well. So we hope to see some of you there too. Thank you.